Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for staying with us right to the very end. I know that we've got a fantastic afternoon that's going to reward you richly for staying to the very end. As you might know, looking at the program, we have a series of presentations from a very significant international research project that our very own Professor John Sloboda has been leading, and we're really looking forward to hearing many diverse perspectives from the team members who've been involved in this significant research. I know I've been looking forward to this afternoon's sessions not only all day, but since this grant was actually first announced. I think it's obviously a very significant one for our field, and the findings are going to be very relevant to everybody who's here today. I think I've met all of you by now, had conversations with you, you've heard me asking questions, but if there's somebody I haven't met who's just arrived, my name's Brydie-Leigh Bartleet and I'm from Australia, and very, very honoured and delighted to be chairing this final session. The way it's going to work is we're going to have 4 presentations and then a Q&A. We'll give you a refreshment break and then we'll come back for the remainder of the sessions. But it's now my great pleasure to welcome John Sloboda to the stage, and John's going to give us a really important overview and context for this international research project to kick off the discussions. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brydie. So my presentation sets the scene for the project as a whole before we dive more deeply into the country-specific insights that are emerging. So none of what we report would have been possible without the support of our 2 generous funders, the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK and the SIMM platform. Their support has financed a 3-year project of which we are now in the final months. This project is a collaboration between 5 institutions and thus has 5 senior co-investigators. Over its lifetime, it has employed 6 research fellows. For reasons of time, I won't read out all the names, but what I say represents the contributions of all of them. All are contributing to this session, most in the room, 2 online, and it's been a great privilege to work with such a committed and multi-skilled team. This project was conceived as a response to the globally growing phenomenon of participatory music activities offered in response to social needs of individuals and groups. The SIMM organisation and its international meetings, such as today's, is of course entirely oriented towards understanding and supporting research into this phenomenon. And our project grows directly out of the energies that SIMM has coordinated and amplified. Most existing research is on individual projects with an interest in who the participants are and how the activity benefits them. This is only right and proper, since benefit is the primary goal, and that will be very dependent on the participants, their backgrounds, and their needs. This research looks at many projects in the 4 countries we have chosen, and the specific interest is in the musicians who work in these projects, whether paid or volunteer, whether graduates of higher education, or learning their craft within the community. Why the focus on musicians? The reason for our focus is that outcomes for participants most directly reflect what these musicians do in their sessions, the skills, beliefs, and motivations they bring to their work, and the conditions and constraints under which they operate. Musical practice is also an evolving life skill, which is best understood by taking a holistic view of the musician as person, artist, teacher, facilitator. In this way, we can look more deeply into how the musician got into this kind of work and how their engagement with it has emerged over their working lives. Why did our project focus on the 4 countries, Belgium, Colombia, Finland, and the UK? Firstly, these are countries where there is relevant senior research capacity closely connected to music higher education. This is important both to securely support the research, but also because the research could have strong implications for music higher education institutions in the development of their curricula to support emerging musicians. Second, these 4 countries represent different cultural contexts and stages of development of participatory music as a national enterprise. Including these different countries in a common research framework allows for direct comparisons and contrasts. Our project had 4 phases, and we're now in the last of those phases. Phase A took place in 2020, when we undertook scoping of the context and environment in each country and made a compilation of known projects in each country. Phase B took place in late 2020 and early 2021, using contacts discovered in Phase A to issue a wide call for participation in a practitioner survey. We received 631 responses across the 4 countries, 318 of which were complete. In Phase C, which took the whole of 2021, we conducted in-depth interviews with 88 volunteer survey respondents, 21 in Belgium, 23 in Colombia, 20 in Finland, 24 in the UK. In Phase D, we are in the midst of intensive analysis of this data, moving into dissemination, where we have begun to share our results. A note on the pandemic. Since most of the research was conducted under the extraordinary conditions imposed by the pandemic, we felt it important to comment on this. Our survey and interview data was gathered from October 2020 until December 2021, when all 4 countries were in varying degrees of COVID-related restrictions. However, the questions we asked our participants focused on pre-pandemic practice, going back 5 or more years. There were some extra questions on the effects of the pandemic on their practice, but this was not the focus of the study. We do, however, acknowledge that the pandemic experience may have coloured some responses, but most responses were notable for how little the pandemic was mentioned. We had planned that as many interviews as possible would take place face-to-face. In the event, they were all done remotely, by Zoom or telephone. Pandemic restrictions also forced us to cancel all planned face-to-face meetings of our research team, instead conducting them remotely. And so today is the first and also the last time that all current members of our team meet face-to-face. And that's a real joy, if also tinged with a bit of sadness that more was not possible. Going back in a bit more detail, Phase A, the scoping phase, involved a comprehensive survey of public domain information in all 4 countries. The scoping phase allowed us to clarify questions going forward, such as, is there an underlying commonality in the formation, beliefs and practices of practitioners which transcends cultural differences? How does the national context influence practitioners? How strong is the critical narrative in each country? And what can we learn which will help to train and develop the practitioners of the future? The outcomes of Phase A are reported in an article published in the Finnish Journal of Music Education. This is a free online journal publishing in English, but the article is currently being translated into Spanish for a wider readership, as we hope also for other outputs of the project. In Phase B, the qualifying condition for entry to the survey was the question, are you a musician aged 18 or over working in, for example, Colombia, who has recently worked in the community to achieve both musical and social goals? To assist participants further, we clarified this work as activities focused on marginalized or excluded groups, such as in regions of poverty, conflict, or social disruption, mental or physical impairment, people in prisons, or those who are homeless. And assist participants to perform music for its intrinsic value, as well as helping them to achieve defined social goals such as inclusion, empowerment, community building, or activism. And all of this is abbreviated as SIMM practice in this context. The descriptors that the participants used to characterize themselves in their roles as SIMM practitioners were very varied. And just to give you a flavor of this, each country team has compiled an indicative set of self-descriptors. I won't attempt to mangle vernacular pronunciations by reading these out, but you can see in each country the range of words spontaneously used by respondents to describe themselves. Here in Belgium, here in Colombia, noting that some musicians prioritize their positionality in the ongoing internal conflict as the primary focus of their musician identity, as in forced displaced person. Our Colombian colleagues will come back to this point in their presentation. Here are a set of Finnish self-descriptors. and finally in the UK, where the range of self-descriptors is also wide. All this points to an area of professional practice which has fuzzy edges and should not be too rigidly defined by boundaries. A lot of the analysis of the survey results has been in-country. However, we have conducted some analyses looking at more quantitative measures across countries. Let me give just two examples. One question asked about the size of organisation in which the musicians worked. This is the left multicoloured bar for each country. Black indicates an organisation employing more than 50 people, which we have defined as a large organisation. You can see that the country distribution is very different. Only Colombia had a majority of respondents from such large organisations. In the other countries, musicians were much more likely to work in small organisations of 12 people or less, the yellow bars. This speaks to the different organisational conditions in the different countries. The Colombian scene is dominated by a small number of large, Sistema-inspired orchestral programs, reaching thousands of children, and in some cases employing hundreds of staff. Whereas in Europe, smaller, often self-organised projects are far more common. A second question asked whether the musician had received any specific training for this socially oriented work. A possible hypothesis was that the larger organisations would have larger training capacity and programmes. But this appeared not to be straightforwardly the case. Colombia, Finland, and the UK all had high proportions of musicians who answered yes to this question, with Belgium having significantly lower levels. But interestingly, even in the cases where the answer was yes, this was more likely to be a workshop or a short course rather than an extended formal qualification. Moving on because of time. Phase C of the study produced around 200 hours of interview material, which has been meticulously transcribed and subject to thematic analysis. That intensive qualitative analysis is, in fact, still underway. Each country team has led on the transcription and analysis of its own data for obvious cultural and linguistic reasons. But this analysis is yielding interesting points of cross-country comparison, which you will hear about later this afternoon. The presentations that follow are illustrated with direct quotes from respondents. These quotes are anonymized and identified only by ID number. For this symposium, they are also all translated into English and lightly edited for clarity. Of course, the original quotes are in one of the vernacular languages of the country concerned, and translations have been verified by a native speaker of that language. The final phase, well, we are reporting results at academic conferences and seminars, national and international, of which this is one. This, however, is the only conference where the entire team is contributing. We are also organising national events aimed at the practitioner community, with the Belgium and Colombia events already completed, and events in Finland and the UK still to come. 7 academic journal articles are currently in preparation or submission, and possibly more will come if the capacity allows. There will also be some more practitioner-focused outputs from some of the countries. So that, in fact, I should have shown earlier. We are now at the end of my presentation, and I hand back to Brydie. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, John, for an excellent overview that I'm sure has whet our appetite to now hear from each of the individual country presentations. And great to hear the rationale and the importance of this research in terms of studying the musicians themselves, not just the participants, and also the benefits that can come from a multinational perspective. So thank you, John. I'm now very pleased to welcome both Sari and Heidi from the University of the Arts in Helsinki, who are going to be talking about a portfolio or a protein career path, musicians' work values in a social practice in the context of Finland. Over to you both. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sari, and this is Heidi, and she will start. So in this presentation, we will provide early findings from an analysis of the semi-structured narrative interviews of 20 musicians who identify themselves as socially engaged professionals in the Finnish context. Here we call their practice simply as SIMM. Our interviewees typically worked outside of large organizations and are freelancing, mostly with the support of scholarships. Most of them had developed their practice themselves and have practiced SIMM for more than 5 years. Some of them had professional education in music, representing various musical genres, including folk music, while some had another higher education background, for instance, theology or social work. In this sub-study, we analyzed the interview data abductively from the perspective of these musicians' work values, and especially against the understandings of a portfolio and protean career orientations. In the field of music, researchers have already argued that we should widen the definition of a professional musician to include work in several specialist areas, and that a suitable approach for this is the portfolio career, which is goal to maximize the employment opportunities of musicians. Protean career, for its part, has been defined through the specific values of personal growth, freedom, and work-related self-determination. In this way, protean career orientation emphasizes self-directed meanings and involves a strong calling. In principle, any values can guide a protean career as long as these values are congruent with the individual's internal core values. However, protean career orientation is less motivated by extrinsic motivators such as money, status, and promotion. The musicians gave rich descriptions in their interviews on what they gained from SIMM work, and their narratives also reveal that they were used to justify their practice. Several of them had taken a major career shift, changing to SIMM from, for instance, engineering or journalism. The economical aspect may have been the initial motive for some of these musicians, but hardly any of them seemed to earn significantly from SIMM. Instead, the musicians' narratives expressed a heavily values-driven orientation. So here we decided to analyze the interviews from the perspective of the dimensions of work values, and we use theorization by Yin and Round, who identify four broader work values domains, which are intrinsic and extrinsic work values, social relational work values, and status work values. Our analysis was also inspired by the concept of work orientation. Then the question is how the interviewees see the role and value of work in their life as a whole. Is it a job, or is it a career, or more like a calling? So against this theorization, our research questions were, what work values can be identified in the SIMM musician narratives in the Finnish context, and how are their work values related to the understandings of the portfolio and protean career orientations? How do the SIMM practitioners see the role and value of work in their life? And Sari continues.
Thank you. Next, I will give you some quotes from the data. I'm not going to read them aloud, but pick out some important notions. According to the narratives, musicians gain many types of non-pecuniary rewards from their SIMM practice and find meaningfulness in it. It is, for instance, described as emotionally rewarding. In SIMM practice, musicians enjoy the possibility to work independently and creatively and to develop an approach of their own. This is a contrast, for instance, to orchestra work. They also find pleasure in working with many kinds of people. And they also find to be the engine there instead of being part of a big machine like in an orchestra. Sharing the skills and being of service to other people is a driver of action for many SIMM practitioners. Some use the term servant artist to describe their role, and they find well-being in it. Some musicians claim to be so passionate about their SIMM practice that they are willing to accept low incomes in return to psychological gains. Many interviewers seek congruence between their personal and work-related values and identities. For some interviewers, SIMM work was their identity. So, is this a portfolio of protein career orientation? It is typical of Finnish SIMM practitioners, of Finnish SIMM, that practitioners work independently and manage their own careers. The employment aspect that is central in a portfolio career may have been the initial driver for some, but as Heidi mentioned, only a few earn notably from SIMM. Although many held multiple jobs, their aim was to dedicate more time to SIMM. Most importantly, the narratives were heavily value-laden. The Finnish SIMM practitioners' narratives resonate a lot with the protein career. Theirs is a mixture of creative, artistic, and social values and goals that could be labeled as a double calling. They all took the social aspect to be fundamental in music making, and they were striving for an accordance between their personal values and their work choices, their career choices. Moreover, in our reading of the narratives, they embody an opposition to the dominant practices in the music system. In this sense, SIMM practice is a counter-hegemonic career choice, not just another source of income. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Heidi and to Sari for such a thought-provoking presentation. I'm looking across the room right now and wondering how many of the practitioners in the room will be resonating. I'm seeing nodding heads resonating with what their findings have revealed. I love that, a counter-hegemonic career choice. Some very thoughtful words there about protein careers and SIMM practice. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Anemone and Anne, who's going to also join you from Ghent. I'm very curious about this title, Being Close Without Being Close, Effective Challenges in Participatory Music Projects. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Great that you are all here, and also the people online. Very welcome. Sorry for my voice. I'm a bit ill, but I'm still here. Anne and I have been actually throughout this project mainly been working on the conceptualization of social impact seen from the practitioner's perspective. So do watch out for our upcoming article on that. But as we presented that elsewhere already, today we will be focusing on a topic which has more to do with practitioners' well-being. Sari and Heidi just talked about very positive, emotionally loaded experiences of participants. Today we will also say something about affective challenges musicians may face in this subject. In the UK, the health and well-being of musicians is an area receiving more and more attention via research, campaigns, dedicated organizations. There is an awareness raised for the effective support of musicians working in participatory practices. In Belgium, however, this awareness seems not yet to be that present. So therefore, this paper investigates whether musicians leading participatory music projects are emotionally affected by the stories and situations of participants, how they deal with this in the process of creating music together, which strategies of effective protection they use, and what kind of effective support they receive or wish for. Briefly about our data, we interviewed 21, it's a bit multidimensional here. We interviewed 21 musicians, transcribed all the interviews verbatim, and here you see an overview of the main characteristics of the Belgian musicians we interviewed. So a distribution in terms of gender, main age group, their background in musical training, and whether they had any training in social work. The participatory music activities the musicians reported about included this list, so ranging from community orchestras to workshops to one-to-one coaching. And they were aimed at engaging often everybody. Inclusiveness is a big topic in Belgium. They really try to engage everyone. And here are some other ways of describing the people they aimed to engage specifically. Then over to some findings. First, are musicians emotionally affected by their work? In which way? We found that 15 out of 21 musicians mentioned examples which emotionally affected them. 7 indicated that they could not easily forget what they heard or saw. So here's a quote by a musician who said, "With the children, it happened once that I went inside the house. I regretted that because it was so distressing. I actually really struggled with that. Something like that is seared into your memory." And 5 musicians indicated how intense the work can be and how it can emotionally drain them. Here, a musician quoted who says, "It was really an energy drain. It was often, especially after a concert, that I felt that I was physically spent or tired the following day, then that I needed to recover." We move on to the next questions. Are musicians emotionally affected by their work? Oh, sorry, it's still the same question. 3 of them indicated that they went too far in trying to help people. And here's a long quote by a musician giving an example of this. She said, "There was a man in the asylum seeker centers. We were working on a project, and suddenly he said, 'I have to say something. I got negative. I have to leave the country within 6 days.' I then did all kinds of things for him. I looked for a host family. I helped him apply for a VAT number to start his own business. I actually did the work of the social assistant, who had not informed him. She had just given him a form saying he had to leave the territory within 6 days. But I am the piano coach. I mean, do you understand? But I just had to help because I had built up such a bond with that person. Then I thought, next week he will be homeless. I'm not going to let him languish in Brussels South train station." Then 2 out of 21 musicians also indicated that they were not emotionally affected. Here's a musician explaining, "When I work in prison, I don't know why they are there, and I never ask them that question. They write texts, but these are poetic texts. So through the text, I have access to little pieces of what is going on, what may have happened, what is happening in prison, all that. But in fact, I don't have access to their personal story, and I don't ask access for their story." And 4 out of 21 musicians did not mention any emotional situations during the interviews. Then, do emotional experiences get a place when creating music together? Interestingly, we found that about half of the musicians stated that they tried to keep personal or emotional experiences outside the music making. As one musician says, "I don't want to be the psychologist. I don't want to be the Red Cross. I am the musician and I want to share the music, share what I know. If you have problems, leave them outside. Problems with family, work, all this you may leave outside. We are here to sing." Then about the other half, they indicate that they use personal or emotional experiences as input for the music making. So here was a musician saying, "To be honest, I actually kind of like it when I have someone in a group with something that is intense, because then it can be chatted about. Then you see all those underlying layers, then you can come back to that pain, a pain which may be quite universal. Then later in life, these gets may be much milder with people who react violently. That's actually how I deal with that. I don't run away from it. I think let's discuss about it." Then, which strategies of effective protection do musicians use? One thing that we found was absolutely crucial is the organizational support and social workers being present. So here is a quote exemplifying that. She says, "What's crucially important is the organization around you that looks after you. Without that, I wouldn't have done it, because it was so difficult. In TOSO, that is, Youth Street Orchestra. There might be other projects that are a bit more straightforward, but TOSO wasn't easy. Very serious problems, and alcohol and people fighting, people with psychosis and severe problems, all in the same room together. And there's a woman in there too. I thought myself, come on, you can do it. It was possible because we were supported. When they asked, how was it? I said, the rehearsal went well. And then someone from the organization said, great. Well, it was going a bit less well here. We had to fight outside, people were beating each other up, and finally the police came. Well, I didn't notice any of that. We just played music. Another aspect that was quite central is the professional relationship, the way you relate as a musician towards the participants. And I quoted a musician who said, being close without being close. As a musician who explains, I think I keep a bit more distance now as a person. I might be a bit more professional now, in the sense that I don't reveal too much personal information, less than before. I think I have found a different way to connect and create a kind of trust and intimacy with people. It's a bit more reserved, let's say. It's a bit of self-protection, too. And another one who says, you have to find the right balance. Be close without being close. Then, what kind of effective support do musicians receive or wish for? As we already said, the organizational support and social workers being present is found to be key. Talking to others, peers, professional carers. Here's a musician saying, I have a few friends who work in psychiatry and in the social sector. I think I learned quite a bit from them, from the way they deal with their people and clients. The other way around as well. Those are always interesting discussions. Making music is also mentioned. Here a musician who says, how do I protect myself from emotional stories that really get under my skin? Playing. Yes, I think a lot of songs and pieces are born out of an emotion I absorbed from some story. And when you play, it comes out, you vent it somehow. Also people talking about taking some rest or visiting a coach or a psychologist. Here's a musician saying, I just have a very good coach myself, personally, privately, who helps me with that. I think people in our sector can struggle with that I want to rescue everyone. To sum up, some conclusions and recommendations. We found that musicians working in participatory music projects may come across situations and stories which deeply affect them. The support of an organization and of social workers or health professionals being present is found to be key. Musicians best should be enabled to focus on the music making while being very sensitive to social aspects themselves as well, obviously. Musicians best keep the relationship with participants somewhat professional, in the sense that they keep some distance and do not go too far in trying to rescue participants. A network of peers and social workers or health professionals with whom a musician meets to reflect on their work is recommended, and effective support, resources and time should be taken into account when writing and funding project proposals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anemone, and to Anne as well. Such a vital and important area of research. We recognised in earlier presentations the emotional labour and the emotional toll that this kind of work can have. So such incredibly important findings there and recommendations around support structures. I'm now going to invite John and Joe from Guildhall to give a presentation. Well, it looks like it might be Joe. Pathways to effective and ethical practice. So the plot thickens with another presentation. I hope you're weaving threads between all of the interesting insights that we've had so far. Over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Well, hello again, everyone in the room and online. Thank you for joining. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank John Sloboda and the Music for Social Impact team for welcoming me so warmly to the project in April of this year. As I'm relatively new and as our presentation time is brisk, what John and I offer today is a short snapshot into an article that we are currently developing. Oh, I have this. So, what are pathways the routes, the ways towards effective and ethical participatory practice? Well, this is a pertinent question if we consider the growth of participatory music practices that have been documented in many parts of the world, increasing attention to the complexity and ambiguities of the field, and the potential to harm, not just help. We address this question also because for the UK practitioners that we interviewed, in outlining the complexities, possibilities, and ambiguities of their practices, they pointed towards elements of effective and ethical working. In the UK context, and over recent decades, this has been given increasing attention. So what are the ways that we can work more effectively and ethically in varying ways by organisations, practitioners, researchers, funders, and others? This image just offers a snapshot of some of those publications. We have, for example, the Artworks 2014 Code of Practice, developed in association with the Paul Hamlin Foundation, which offers a common code for high-quality participatory arts, and then research publications such as those that have been touched on already. I think Imogen Flower this morning mentioned Eleonora Belfiore's 2021 article, Who Cares?, which outlines harmful and unethical practices, notably the ways in which practitioners experience harms, and this has resonated with many in the UK practitioner community. So in short, this is a live and ongoing and complicated issue which warrants further consideration. However, it's complicated because, not least, since, as Francois Matarasso has highlighted, good is contingent. An arts programme cannot be judged good or bad unless the concept of good is defined. Good for what? Good for whom? And good in comparison with what? Here, John and I turn to understandings of good as posited by the practitioners that took part in the study. What constitutes good for them and their practice? Well, whilst there will be and are differences, for many, being together, creating, opportunities for expression, and equity were considered as overarching facets of what constitutes good. For example, this practitioner said, in my sense of good, which is a kind of, perhaps, a slightly different sense of good, it's that human sense of, these are human beings being together in a creative and productive and equal kind of way. Another said, I have a guy who sings the same song most weeks. Being able to literally be with him, it doesn't matter what's right and what's wrong, I think that's a really good thing. Since participatory practice is a relational practice, and so many of you in the room have commented on this in your presentations, not least Dave Camlin and others over the last few days, a relational practice between people and place and their music making, these facets of good must be understood in their situated and nuanced contexts. I've said that already, which is good. We've heard very many of the practitioners in the room this week say that relationship is central, whether that might be in the sense of being in resonance, as Harmut Rosa offered, or whether it's about a reflection between the relationship between our work and the wider systemic structures of power that we operate within. As practitioners in this study explain, relationship building, I guess, is the key thing. It doesn't matter how good your model is or how big your evidence base is. If the relationship isn't right with the person you're working with, it's not going to work. And there is that constant relation to yourself as part of the group and a constant learning from. And meanings have to be interpreted, if you like, in the context of each person's relationship and way of relating. And one practitioner, when reflecting on developing capabilities for the work, emphasised relationship to the point that they said, The preparation, I think, is in the relationships you have around you. And as a relational practice, musicians cannot come to know all that will be encountered in advance of the work. As this practitioner explains, the main thing is doing it, actually, strangely. People need to learn through experience. You know, you can train, but until you start actually going into those situations, you won't know. Whilst codes of practice, private study, qualifications and impeccable plans can help, I'm not saying don't have them, it's in and through the doing that the work is made good in the messy context of people's varying needs, wishes and capacities, which practitioners navigate through iterative processes of reflection and experimentation. As this practitioner explains, I'm observing, obviously, and I am being reflexive in the moment, what they call reading the room. I'm looking to see people's facial expressions, people's eye contact. I'm also tuning into what's going on inside of me. It's a balancing act. Or as this practitioner succinctly puts it, reflection is part of the culture of what we are doing. This has been posited as critical practice in fields such as community music, music education, and museum studies. Critical practice incorporates a constantly refining of one's concept of what good is, sometimes in ways that point towards a different aesthetic with its own qualities and sensibilities, as we'll discuss further in the country comparison paper later in this session. In this critical reflexivity around what good means, we can see elements of an ethical practice, a practice which musicians often see the need for, but are not often given the space for, as our UK practitioners report, in the harsh funding parameters and structural conditions within which they operate. In short, enacting a critical practice is complex, not least because that doing exists between conflicting fields of institutional goals, defined roles, personal desires, and interpersonal relationships, as many interviewees pointed out. For example, these practitioners explain that reflection is important but rarely paid for. Reflection is so vitally important after every session that we deliver. I think reflection has to happen in order to keep us in touch with why we're doing this and help us to understand why different people might be reacting to things in different ways. Often that reflection time isn't financially factored into projects. I'm only being paid a certain amount. I don't have the time before or after to reflect. Lack of support as a consequence of short-term working, and we heard lots about short-term working on Monday, presents another challenge. This practitioner says, I can see something that I'm being asked to do, and I think I would need this amount of support. This, by the way, sorry to interrupt, is an orchestral freelance musician that takes part in participatory projects as part of their practice. Under these circumstances, invitation to a one-off project, how realistically is that going to happen? So often it's a short-term project, so that's not really in the budget. The instrumentalisation of music, which in the context of under-resourced projects with increasing outcomes to hit, can lead to musicians edging towards roles beyond their experience and expertise. And I think Anemone and Anne's presentation just touched on that really well. Here we have a practitioner saying, I don't think musicians should be responsible for all the necessary work which goes into organising a project of any substance. I guess what I should say is a musician's job is to be a musician. Now, this musician was very clearly voicing concern about having to work as fundraiser, as social worker, and not just with the skills that they have developed. Now, I know I'm really near the end, Brydie, and complexity in practice. It's almost as if I was reading the room. No, complexity in practice has been outlined by so many of our practitioners. In fact, I won't read all of these quotes, I'll just touch on this one. This person says, I was thrown into a situation of just like play. I really think the preparation you get as a musician is not complete when you're dealing with these situations. They go on to talk about the need for trauma-informed working. Other practitioners show more, but I'm going to skip because I don't want to overstep my time to sum up how we might navigate pathways to effective and ethical participatory practice, which is a live and ongoing issue, and it will be ongoing. It's always a working towards. And since participatory music making is a relational practice, which is enacted in and emerges through doing, we suggest that future research on effective and ethical practice turns to the doing of practice. And since multiple stakeholders are at play, here are just a few, we suggest that future research should be a collaborative endeavour. There has been a lot of research, as John's first presentation highlighted, directed towards the benefits of these projects for participants. This 3-year international project has looked at practitioners, and we wonder, what if research considered practice more holistically? Might that support the kinds of structural, systemic hopes for change that others have talked about over these last few days? So thank you so much. I don't have time to plug our awesome events that will be practitioner orientated here in London down the road on March the 1st. We will send details, and an online event on the 30th of January where we'll consider some of these issues from the Belgium and UK perspectives. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jo. There was so much in what you said there, and so much that also connected with conversations that we've had over the last 3 days. So I'm sure there are going to be many questions. On that note, we're going to pause now and have a brief Q&A before the tea break. So I'd like to invite all of our speakers to please come and join. No doubt each of these presentations has raised a wide range of questions, as I said, that certainly relate a lot to the topics of conversation over the last few days. Thank you all. I think we've covered a lot of very interesting territory, even in the presentations we've had so far, from the values underpinning how these musicians craft a livelihood, to considerations of the emotional labour of this work, to the ethical dimensions of this complex, relational, and as you pointed out, Jo, precarious work at the same time. There's a lot going on for all of these musicians. I'm really curious to start with the big question. If we were to put the insights from all of these presentations together and craft some recommendations that we would like to make to higher education institutions, but also maybe to emerging musicians interested in taking up a career in this particular field, what sorts of big messages do you think come out of all of these presentations when looked at collectively together? John, I might start with you as the leader of the project with the macro bird's eye view of what's happening here. Together, when all of these issues are looked at, what sorts of recommendations do you think a project like this could make to higher education, but musicians as well?
I should actually say that that's not an issue that I yet feel the project is ready to make, and I'm very committed to collective decision making, and so that's a task for us for the future. But I would say, and I think this was picked up by various points in other presentations, that the people that responded to our survey have some very special characteristics. And it was wonderful to hear Heidi and Sari's characterization of the protean career. And I think there's a corollary to that, which is this work is not for everybody. And so I think we need to somehow craft a set of recommendations which is not dismissive of or condescending towards the many musicians who still would see themselves as pursuing traditional careers in performance and teaching and so on. So it's about crafting the special conditions for this work, but not trying to say to music higher educations that everybody in your conservatoire should do it. So I think I'll just leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, John. Heidi, would you like to add to that
I
from
could
your
continue.
perspective?
I paid attention to, in Joe's presentation, on the doing and context. And I think that is a key thing, that higher music education is concentrating on concert halls and a certain kind of setting. And you actually need to get out of that setting in order to understand what this kind of work is. And that came out also in our data. The musicians were really aware that it might look easy, but it's not, and that they did not learn this in higher music education, where everything is set in certain ways, pointing towards the highest level of concert hall and performances. And I think that's essential, at least.
I
Sari?
could just continue on Heidi's note that I think this kind of work needs continuous learning and that kind of an attitude that you're willing to develop your practice by every mean you can invent, by reading books, taking courses, talking with your colleagues, reflecting on your practice, taking feedback, etc.
Thank you, Sari. And obviously development of your own practice in a creative musical sense and how you're working in context. But Anemone, what I also took out of yours was also a self-care awareness of how to look after ourselves in this work. I've long thought that the precarious nature of how socially engaged musicians work means they go into very complex contexts. We've heard about some of these, where there's the potential for vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and all those things that we know can happen, but very little structural apparatus to look after them and awareness around how to care for selves in the process. And I thought some of the presentations really spoke very nicely to that aspect of developing ourselves. I didn't know if anyone else wanted to pick up on that.
Something from the data of the survey is that in Belgium, for example, 47% of the musicians say that they are responsible for the whole project, so from organizing to everything. And as if we combine this with the presentation we gave today, I think it's precarious, the work, and I think a message to the musician can be to try to be surrounded by professionals from other sectors, like social workers, or try to work in an organization, to have that support, because I think it makes really a big difference.
Absolutely, and recognises we're not experts when it comes to social work and a range of other different fields, which is what one of the quotes said. Jo, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm speaking very much from a UK context because alongside being invited to the project, I'm a practitioner in the UK context. For me, the biggest thing is to do with the precarity and a durational working. We've had a lot of discussion these last few days about the values of the practices, perhaps not corresponding with or being understood in the context in which they're being situated. So, and I think that rather than constantly reinventing the wheel, we've got a lot of learning here that we can return to and return over and keep reflecting on. And if we keep changing the flavour of the month, that's not going to help. So that's my personal plea, long-term durational working.
Absolutely. I can see lots of nodding heads in terms of moving beyond a hamster wheel of both practice and also the funding imperative that underpins that as well. You're soon going to get an opportunity to ask your burning questions, but there is a question from the chat which I'd like to give voice to because it comes from your colleague, Alessandro. Concerning SIMM work with asylum seekers, and this is to Anemone and in particular, concerning SIMM work with asylum seekers and refugees, what are the ethical implications for practitioners working with vulnerable participants such as asylum seekers, particularly concerning status vulnerability and the related imperative to have a positive evaluation of their case by the migration control authorities and be recognised as refugees? Can the musical artistic experience still be prioritised as one of the interviewees seemed to point out, leave your problems behind. I think this speaks to a specific case, but also some of the broader ethical implications of the work that we do. Would you like to respond to Alessandro?
Okay, I'll do it. Well, of course, we cannot answer this from the data, but yes, of course, it is very important that this asylum seeker gets a positive answer and that he can stay in the country. But I think it's not in the scope of the musician to make sure that happens. So yes, that would be my answer. Yeah, and. Maybe to look at it from more of a distance, I think this quote that Anemone said, the musician is focusing on the music only and leave the problems behind. You can compare it to teaching in a classroom. So some teachers, they really take all the problems of the children in the classroom, but other teachers, they see it as this is a free space where that enables you to learn exactly because you can leave your problems behind. So you can look at it as well from that side. It doesn't have to be negative to leave your problems behind. It can be positive. It can enable you to enter a free space. I think in this sense the quote must be understood. Am I correct?
Yes, and I think what we pointed out that there were kind of half of the musicians really said like leave it out, of which is this one quote of like leave it outside, we are here to sing. Quote an example, and the other half really welcome it and use it in their practice. For instance, there was another musician also talking about an asylum seeker center context, giving an example that someone was struggling with the noise there, and then they started recording that noise and turn it into a composition, and in that way that person could really process their problem. So that's really the opposite of taking on the environment, the problems inside the music making, and help you transform it. So there, yeah. In Alessandro's quote, he's comparing the examples of the two sides, so to say, of the continuum.
That's really interesting. Was the idea of boundary setting or scope creep, as we might call it, something that came up in the data in any of the other interviews that people did, and how musicians negotiated those very fuzzy boundaries? It seems like it's a very personal choice. Sari?
Well, it's just one interview from Finland came to my mind when listening to this discussion, and there was a lady composer who was not drawing any line between her private self and herself as a musician, and she was helping asylum seekers and especially musicians, and was in my mind was perhaps going too far because for her own well-being. So I have been thinking of what could be professional in SIMM from this perspective. Where do you draw the line, and how do you make the distinction between yourself as a musician and your own person? As we were talking about the Plotian career, and the distinction is really, there's no distinction actually in the end.
Yes.
It's a bit dangerous, perhaps.
Interesting. Well, we certainly are in dangerous, precarious territory here that's been well articulated and identified from each of the presentations. I do want to give the floor to our audience to see if there is a question that might be burning. There will be another Q&A after the next set of presentations, but you might have something that you really would like to ask at this point.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for these presentations. I have taken a lot for it. I just had a question which come to mind from the German discussion about this area, because we tend to see like the ethical responsibility and the self-care aspect as two very separate things. but there's a whole discussion in the German context about the possible implications also for the targeted group when the self-care aspect isn't there. So in the specific case of refugees or asylum seekers, when people are like overwhelmed, a musician working in these projects, it can actually tend bring like a re-traumatization of an already vulnerable group. So also under this aspect of sustainability and of responsibility, this self-care also has to do with the care of the group you're working with. And I would like to know if you have already seen this connection in the projects you have been researching.
Great question. Thank you. Who would like to take?
Yeah, one remark from a musician comes immediately to mind who says, it's very important that you know what you don't know and what you shouldn't take on. And also that during a session, you shouldn't open up things which you can't close again. So yeah, also thinking about Joe's presentation on the reflective awareness, yeah, really knowing your own boundaries as a practitioner is very important. And I, if it comes to those musicians who went maybe too far in helping others or trying to rescue others, we had some very pregnant examples of that. Oh, now I'm losing my train of thought. I'm sorry, I'm lost. But
what you've said was a really interesting reflection, and it also made me think about our conversations on day one about working in contexts where there are macro structural forces that we can sometimes influence but sometimes can't. And we might be working as socially engaged musicians in contexts like these, well, in Australia they're called detention centres, with government policies that we cannot affect and change, yet we are still trying to make a positive experience in participants' lives, and that can lead to incredible strain to the musicians who aren't able to have that kind of macro level structural change that they're hoping for. Is there another question before we break for tea? One last opportunity. Put your hand up, Tina. Yes, don't hesitate. Stick it up.
I'm just thinking of this quote of Bertolt Brecht that he says, "Eerst das fressen, dan die moraal," or die moraal. So I'm thinking that if I was in the center with this person that said to me that he had a negative, he was broken after 2 years of stress, and I couldn't continue the rehearsal. So I'm thinking also that in these centers there should be also more help for these persons, because they just give them the news by a letter in their mailbox. So as a musician, you cannot look behind. Mm-hmm. So there should be also more care for the people that live in the center, and it's not our work as a musician, but you cannot look away. So that's what I wanted to add, because I find it so important. And I was so happy to meet this person in London, since he crossed the North Sea in a boat to get here. So we are still friends. And even if you are attached by people and your participants, you can still build friendships, and it is very deep in life. So I don't see it as a problem to help people, even it was very hard in that moment.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you. That was a wonderful reflection and a story. Did any of the panelists want to pick up on that, or we might?
I just wanted to say what you said, and maybe that's an answer to Alessandro as well. So, of course, the priority here is the visa for this person. But the question actually is, should the musician do that? And I think it comes to your personal strength, what you can cope with as a musician. It will be different for everyone. Someone will take on a lot of problems, others can't, to answer that call. But in the first place, there should be other professionals for whom this is their job.
Yes. Indeed, and that actually ties in nicely to a question we have in the chat, and this will be the final question before we break for tea, from Tanya, who says, "Thank you for this excellent session. And I am curious to learn more about research threads that may have emerged around the expressed need of musicians to have the support and acknowledgement of their peers and the opportunity to learn in a community of other community practitioners. In your research, did musicians offer examples of peer-driven supports that they found effective or offer suggestions for creating these kinds of structures? Would anybody like to comment on that really important point from Tanya?
Yes, at least in Finland, that is really common, that people are gaining and giving peer support. They might work in couples, I mean, sometimes even married couples, but the peer support is also has emerged after courses for community music, and they have been working afterwards together, or they have. They meet each other, they know that they can phone somebody and ask for advice and so on. It's really common and really helpful.
Thank you, Sari. Joe, you wanted to add to that?
I've got kind of a lag in responding because I'm trying to filter out personal experience and the interviews. But just returning to 3 of the UK interviews, there was one practitioner in Scotland, we should say the UK's 4 countries, I won't say that in the last presentation now because we've got that on the floor, who talked about the benefits of co-facilitation, of working within a team and of being able to unpack things that present in the workshop space immediately after through a debrief. And also working within multidisciplinary teams where they're fortunate to work with mental health specialists and so forth. There was a duo, I actually wondered if they were a married couple, but they're not, who've been working together for 30 years, who really heavily rely on their friendship. It's a friendship working together. And then finally there is an organisation, 2 of the representatives were interviewed, and they have supervision for their members in the way that you might have the supervision for music therapy. And there was quite a difference in the way that music therapists spoke about their practices and community musicians or animators or people that describe themselves in other ways.
Thank you so much, Joe. That's a lovely response and a great point from Tanya as well. So thank you. I'm going to close by turning to you, John. I'm looking at this amazing group of collaborators here that you have and the wonderful opportunity that this study has offered for a perspective across a wide range of cultural contexts. When you started this session, you talked about the fact that often this research is in small, isolated pockets. I'd love to just hear your reflections on the joys and the benefits of being able to bring together multiple different projects across different countries and the sort of benefits and the joys that come for a project leader such as yourself to have this collaborative opportunity.
Well, I would say that working across quite different cultural contexts takes all of us as researchers in our individual context out of our comfort zones to reach towards and understand the context in another country, which is sometimes quite inflected and difficult to grasp. And so the intercultural learning has been both, I think, in some cases difficult, but also a wonderful benefit of this. And while I've got the microphone, I would just say I've been mulling on your initial question about recommendations, which kind of caught me a bit blindsided. But then I realized, of course, that one of the reasons why I don't want, as project director, to make recommendations is that each country is going to have to craft a very specific set of recommendations which actually address the conditions, the political, the structural, the fiscal conditions in those countries. And so there may not be very much that we can say as a whole. But the other thing is, and certainly this is the way that Joe and I want to work in the UK, that we don't think it's our place alone to make recommendations on the basis of this research. We're going to take our findings to a group of practitioners in March and collectively with them craft what they think the recommendations should be going forward for practice. So I just wanted to come back to that and add a little bit.
Thank you, John. That's a great note to follow, with a cup of tea and further conversation. I think a really important point in terms of broader research processes and how we conduct these sorts of projects and make recommendations that are actually locally and culturally specific. So would you please join me in thanking our wonderful presenters for such a fantastic start to this session.